There are moments in history when a people can survive without knowing where they are going, but they cannot survive without knowing who they are. Before kingdoms had names, before crowns carried weight, there was a land where communities lived side by side, close enough to hear one another's drums, yet far enough apart to walk different paths. Each group guarded its own fire, each family protected its own ground. They endured, but they did not move forward together. In such a world, no one wakes up expecting to become the keeper of a people's future. And yet, history remembers that someone always does. Long before the name Oduduwa was spoken with reverence, before it was whispered as origin and destiny, there existed a silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence that settles when everyone is waiting for someone else to step forward. The land did not lack warriors. It did not lack elders or traditions. What it lacked was a single spine, strong enough to hold many bodies upright at once. This is not a story about power taken for its own sake. It is a story about responsibility, accepted when avoidance would have been safer. In Yorubaland, before unity had a name, the future was fragile. Communities stood divided, not because they hated one another, but because no one had yet proven that standing together was possible. Every path led back to the same question: who would carry the weight if things went wrong? There are people who wait to be chosen, and there are people who step forward knowing the cost will be theirs alone. The elders would later argue about where he came from, how he arrived, and whether the stories surrounding him belonged more to the earth or to the heavens. But none of them questioned why he was needed. Because when the ground beneath many feet begins to crack, a people does not ask for perfection. They ask for someone willing to stand still long enough for others to gather around them. This story is not being told so you can memorize a name. It is told so you can remember a posture, a way of standing when fragmentation feels normal and responsibility feels heavy. If you listen until the end, you will not only hear about a king, you will understand why, long before the world tried to teach otherwise. African societies knew that leadership was never about domination. It was about carrying what others could not carry alone. And somewhere between earth and memory, a man once decided that if no one would hold the center, he would. Before Oduduwa was seen as a solution, he was shaped by a problem that had existed long before his name was known. Yorubaland was not an empty land waiting to be claimed. It was alive with people, customs, elders, and memory. Villages stood within walking distance of one another, yet each lived as if the others were worlds apart. Every community knew how to survive on its own. What none of them knew was how to survive together. This was not a land without order. It was a land with too many orders, each guarded closely, each unwilling to bend. Authority stopped at the edge of every settlement. Loyalty did the same. When danger came, it was faced alone. When prosperity arrived, it was protected from others. Life moved forward in fragments. Elders taught wisdom within their own walls. Warriors defended only their own soil. Families passed down stories that ended at the borders of their village. No one was wrong for living this way. It was simply the only way they had ever known. But fragmentation carries a quiet cost. When conflict arose between communities, there was no shared language to resolve it. When fear spread, it traveled faster than trust. And when the future demanded coordination, it found none. The land endured, but it could not rise. In moments like these, history does not cry out for a conqueror. It waits for a carrier, someone willing to hold the weight that everyone else keeps setting down. Most people, when faced with such a landscape, choose safety. They tend their own fields. They protect their own children. They tell themselves that unity is someone else's responsibility. This is not weakness. It is human instinct. What made Oduduwa's time different was not that division existed, but that its consequences had become impossible to ignore. Too many decisions ended in stalemate. Too many conflicts returned unchanged. Too many futures collapsed before they could begin. The land was asking a question, without words. How long can a people survive without a center? Before Oduduwa became a leader, he was a witness. He saw how easily strength dissolved when it stood alone. He understood that bravery without coordination becomes waste, and tradition without connection becomes isolation. These were not lessons learned in a single moment. They were absorbed slowly through observation and consequence. This is where his story truly begins. Not with a throne, not with armor, but with an understanding that survival was no longer enough. A people who only survive will eventually forget why they are still here. Yorubaland needed more than protection. It needed coherence. It needed someone willing to stand where paths crossed and say, "This is where we meet. This is where responsibility gathers." Long before he was remembered as a king, Oduduwa was shaped by a land that could not move forward unless someone accepted the burden of togetherness. And that burden, once lifted, would never be set down again. When people later tried to explain where Oduduwa came from, they could never agree on a single answer. Some said he emerged from Okeera, among the hills at the edge of the Ife world. Others said he descended from higher ground, clothed in iron, as if he had stepped into the land already prepared for conflict. Still others spoke of him as a figure whose arrival blurred the line between earth and sky. What matters is not which version is correct. What matters is why none of them were erased. Among the Yoruba, uncertainty about origin was not a weakness. It was an invitation. By leaving Oduduwa's beginnings open, the people made room for him to belong to more than one lineage, more than one place, more than one memory. He was not claimed by a single family. He was claimed by a need. In a fragmented land, clarity can divide, ambiguity can unite. Had Oduduwa been remembered as the son of one village, his authority would have ended at its borders. Had he been tied too tightly to one clan, his leadership would have felt like inheritance rather than responsibility. Instead, his story began in a way that allowed every community to see a piece of itself reflected in him. This was not accidental. Communities shape the memories they need to survive. Oduduwa's unclear origin allowed people to focus not on where he came from, but on why he stayed. It shifted attention away from bloodlines and toward burden. The question was never, whose child is he? It became, can he carry what the rest of us cannot? As stories grew, Oduduwa became less a man with a birthplace and more a figure with a purpose. The hills he descended from became symbols. They represented distance from ordinary life, separation from small concerns, and a vantage point wide enough to see many paths at once. From high ground, one does not only see farther, one sees connections others miss. For Oduduwa, this symbolic distance mattered. It allowed him to stand between communities without belonging fully to any single one. He could speak to all because he was not owned by any. His authority grew not from familiarity, but from trust, earned through presence and resolve. This kind of leadership carries loneliness. To belong everywhere is also to belong nowhere completely. But it is precisely this distance that made people listen. Oduduwa did not arrive carrying the weight of old feuds. He arrived carrying the possibility of something larger. In time, his name would be spoken alongside the origins of kingship itself. But before that happened, he existed in the space between myth and memory, where a people decide what kind of ancestor they need. Oduduwa became that ancestor, not because his beginning was clear, but because his purpose was. There comes a moment when watching is no longer enough. For Oduduwa, that moment did not arrive with ceremony or permission. It arrived quietly, through accumulation, through seeing the same conflicts return unchanged, through witnessing strength wasted because it stood alone, through realizing that waiting for consensus was another way of allowing division to rule. The stories say he came down from the hills wearing iron. That image has endured because it speaks to readiness, not aggression. Iron is not only for striking, it is for endurance. It is for bearing weight. Oduduwa did not step forward as a man hoping to test his strength. He stepped forward as someone prepared to absorb resistance. What separated him from others was not courage alone. Many were brave. What separated him was timing and resolve. He chose to act before certainty arrived. He understood that unity would never come as an invitation. It had to be claimed, and claiming it meant becoming visible to judgment. Once he stepped into that role, there was no return to anonymity. Every movement carried meaning. Every pause was interpreted. When he spoke, people listened not because they agreed, but because they sensed he had already accepted consequences they were still avoiding. This is the point where a man becomes something else. Oduduwa did not wait for a crown to define him. He allowed responsibility to shape him first. He stood where paths crossed, where loyalties conflicted, where fear and hope met without language. In doing so, he made himself a reference point, a place where decisions could gather. That visibility carried risk. To stand in the open is to become a target. To claim responsibility is to invite blame. Oduduwa knew this. The stories remember him not as reckless, but as deliberate. He moved knowing that resistance would follow, knowing that unity forged too early feels threatening to those invested in separation. Yet he moved anyway. This was the moment he ceased being a man of circumstance and became a man of direction. Others reacted to events. Oduduwa began shaping them. He did not force agreement. He forced confrontation with reality. A reality where fragmentation could no longer be disguised as tradition. In this transition, Oduduwa lost something essential. He lost the freedom to retreat. From that point forward, his personal safety mattered less than the coherence of the land. His life became a measure others would use to decide whether unity was worth its cost. This is how leadership is born in African memory, not through proclamation, but through posture, through standing long enough, visibly enough, for others to decide whether they will gather or scatter. Oduduwa stood, and by standing, he crossed the threshold from ordinary life into history. When Oduduwa chose the path of unity, he did not face a single enemy standing across an open field. He faced 13 communities, each with its own pride, memory, and reason for resisting any voice that claimed to speak for all. These were not strangers. They were neighbors. They shared land, trade, and ancestry, yet they did not share trust. Each community had survived by guarding its independence, and independence, once tasted, is not easily surrendered. To bring these communities together was not simply a matter of strength. It was a moral confrontation. Oduduwa was asking them to give up something deeply personal, the belief that standing alone was safer than standing together. He could have ruled a fraction of them and lived comfortably within that limit. Many leaders choose that path. Partial control offers protection. It offers praise without overwhelming responsibility. But Oduduwa understood that incomplete unity would only postpone collapse. A house divided into 13 locked rooms is still a house waiting to fall. Choosing full unification meant accepting full blame. If the land prospered, others would claim credit. If it suffered, the fault would rest on his name alone. This was the unspoken cost of becoming a central figure. By stepping into that position, Oduduwa made himself accountable for outcomes he could not fully control. Conflict followed. Resistance hardened. Those who had never bowed to another voice bristled at the idea of a shared authority. Some saw unity as surrender. Others saw it as erasure. Oduduwa did not dismiss these fears. He carried them with him, knowing that forcing togetherness without acknowledging loss would fracture it from within. The traditions remember his victories, but beneath those victories lies something quieter. Persistence. The willingness to stand firm while being misunderstood. The ability to absorb anger without becoming cruel. These qualities do not appear on battle records, but they determine whether unity survives beyond the moment of conquest. By overcoming the resistance of the 13 communities, Oduduwa did more than establish dominance. He redefined responsibility. Leadership became less about command and more about endurance, less about being followed and more about being answerable. This was the turning point where Oduduwa ceased to be a unifier in theory and became a father in memory. A father does not govern because it is easy. He governs because walking away would leave too much unfinished. From that moment on, the fate of Yorubaland and the fate of Oduduwa were inseparable. If unity failed, his name would bear the weight of that failure. If it endured, generations would inherit something stronger than any single victory. Oduduwa accepted that bargain without ceremony. He did not ask whether the price was fair. He asked only whether the land could afford another generation of division. And having asked that question, he chose to stand where retreat was no longer possible. After unity had been forged, Oduduwa did not tighten his grip. He changed his posture. This is where many leaders fail. They confuse authority with control. They believe that once order is established, it must be constantly enforced through fear or distance. Oduduwa chose a different path. He allowed himself to become something heavier than a ruler and more vulnerable than a commander. He became a sacred center. To be regarded as a divine king among the Yoruba was not to be elevated beyond humanity. It was to be burdened with the responsibility of balance. A sacred king was expected to hold together what could not be held by force alone: land and people, ancestors and descendants, memory and expectation. Oduduwa's presence was no longer measured by commands issued, but by stability maintained. When he entered a space, disputes quieted, not because fear silenced them, but because his role reminded people that disorder had consequences beyond the moment. He embodied continuity. This transformation carried a cost rarely acknowledged. Once Oduduwa became a symbol, he surrendered the right to be ordinary. Every gesture was interpreted. Every silence was examined. Even rest became ritual. He was no longer allowed the luxury of private failure. To be human is to err. To be sacred is to carry the errors of others without flinching. Oduduwa's authority rested not in spectacle, but in restraint. He did not need to demonstrate power constantly. His power was understood. He represented the agreement that unity was worth protecting, even when it was inconvenient, even when it demanded patience. In Yoruba memory, this is why the sacred king mattered. He was not distant. He was present. His role was to absorb tension, so it did not tear the community apart. His body became a boundary. His life became a measure. Leadership at this level isolates. When a person becomes a living symbol, intimacy fades, advice becomes filtered, praise becomes dangerous. Oduduwa carried this solitude quietly. The stories do not describe his loneliness directly, but it is there in what they omit. Sacred figures are remembered for what they hold steady, not for what they endure alone. Yet his endurance shaped generations. By embodying kingship as stewardship rather than dominance, Oduduwa taught a lesson that outlived him. Power, when rooted in responsibility, does not need constant display. It needs consistency. It needs a figure willing to stand still while others move. Oduduwa became that still point, not because he demanded reverence, but because the people needed a place where order could rest without collapsing. This was not the end of his journey. It was the deepening of it, a shift from action to preservation, from conquest to care, and it prepared the ground for what would come next, the choice to let power travel beyond his own hands. Oduduwa understood something that many leaders never do. Power that cannot travel will eventually collapse under its own weight. Having become the sacred center of unity, he faced a final responsibility, not how to rule longer, but how to ensure that what he had built would survive beyond his own breath. This required a different kind of strength, the strength to let go, rather than bind all authority to his person. Oduduwa allowed power to move outward. His children and descendants were sent across Yorubaland, not as conquerors chasing glory, but as carriers of an idea. Each was entrusted with land, people, and a version of the responsibility he himself had carried. This choice was not without risk. To send power away is to accept loss of control. It is to trust that what you planted was deep enough to grow without constant supervision. Oduduwa knew that some would rule wisely and others would struggle. He knew unity could fracture again, yet he chose continuity over perfection. In doing so, he transformed kingship into lineage and responsibility into inheritance. The descendants of Oduduwa did not merely rule territories. They reproduced a structure, a way of governing that centered order, ritual, and accountability. From Ife outward, Yoruba cities grew not as isolated experiments, but as related expressions of a shared origin. Each throne carried echoes of the first. This is how a confederacy is born, not through constant command, but through shared memory. Oduduwa's legacy did not depend on his physical presence. It depended on the strength of what he entrusted to others. He taught that leadership is not proven by how tightly one holds power, but by how well it functions after it leaves one's hands. For the Yoruba, this lesson endured. When rulers failed, they were measured not only against their own actions, but against the standard left behind by their ancestor who believed power should serve continuity, not ego. For people listening today, especially those who have carried families, communities, and histories forward under pressure, this moment resonates deeply. It speaks to the quiet work of building something that will outlive you, of choosing structure over applause, of trusting the next generation with more than instructions. Oduduwa's greatest act was not conquest, it was transmission. By allowing power to travel, he ensured that unity did not die with him. It multiplied, it adapted, it endured. And in that choice, his life became larger than any single reign. It became a foundation upon which others could stand without having to start again from nothing. This is how a man becomes an ancestor, not only by blood, but by responsibility shared. When the name Oduduwa is spoken today, it no longer belongs only to the past. It belongs to posture, to memory, to the quiet decision to stand upright when bending would be easier. He did not leave behind a list of commands or a map carved in stone. What he left was a way of carrying responsibility. He showed that unity is not born from force alone, but from the willingness to accept blame before accepting praise. He chose to hold the center so others could gather without fear. Oduduwa's life reminds us that history is shaped less by victories than by choices. He chose to step forward when silence felt safer. He chose to unify when division felt familiar. He chose to pass power on, trusting that continuity mattered more than control. For those listening now, especially those who have lived long enough to see stories twisted or erased, this is not distant African history. It is a reminder that dignity has always had guardians, long before books reduced us to footnotes or fragments of historical facts. There were societies that understood balance, responsibility, and endurance. This is why his story still matters, not as nostalgia, but as grounding. In a world that often encourages forgetting, Oduduwa stands among history legends who remind us that survival is not enough. Meaning must be carried forward. If this story feels calm, it is because it comes from depth. It is the kind of remembrance that settles the mind, the kind of history for sleep that does not distract, but restores. It invites reflection rather than argument. Oduduwa did not ask to be remembered. He lived in a way that made forgetting impossible. And in remembering him, we remember ourselves not as broken beginnings, but as a people who have always known how to stand. This is not just a chapter of Black history. It is a quiet inheritance, and it is still ours to carry.